Imagine sitting on a small plastic chair beside a busy street in Vietnam. Motorbikes pass in every direction. People talk and laugh around you. And on the table, a small metal filter rests quietly above a glass. One dark drop falls, then another. You wait. A few minutes later, the strong coffee mixes with sweet condensed milk and ice, creating one of Vietnam's most famous drinks. Café Surada. But this is more than just a delicious cup of coffee. Hidden inside it is a story of foreign rule, war, poverty, invention, and an extraordinary national comeback. Coffee did not originally belong to Vietnam. French missionaries brought the first plants into the country in the 19th century. Plantations disappeared during decades of conflict. At one point, Vietnam was so poor that many families could barely find enough food. Yet today, Vietnamese coffee is enjoyed around the world, and along the way, the Vietnamese people created drinks found nowhere else. Coffee sweetened with condensed milk, coffee topped with whipped egg yolk, and even coffee mixed with salted cream. How did a foreign crop become part of Vietnam's identity? How did a bean, once considered inferior, help rebuild an entire economy? And why were Vietnam's most famous coffee drinks born during times of scarcity? Today, we will discover the surprising history behind Vietnamese coffee, one slow, determined drop at a time. And as you listen, do not worry if you cannot understand every word. Learning English is a little like waiting for a Vietnamese phin to finish dripping. At first, progress may seem slow, but every sentence you understand adds something to the cup. So take a breath, relax, and let the story begin. What nobody knew, when French priests first pressed a foreign seed into Vietnamese soil in 1857, was that they had planted something that would one day survive war, defy starvation, and turn a second-rate bean nobody else wanted into a global empire. Brewed one slow, stubborn drop at a time. October. Well, no one recorded the exact date. But sometime in 1857, French Catholic missionaries carried a small coffee plant into the north of Vietnam. Music. It was not a gift. It was not an experiment born from curiosity. It was a colonial crop, planted for one purpose: to be shipped back to France. At the time, Vietnam had no coffee culture of its own. Rice was the crop that fed the nation. Tea was the drink people already knew. Coffee was something entirely foreign, introduced by outsiders who saw the land, not for what it already was, but for what they could extract from it. The first plants were Arabica, the same variety grown across much of the world at the time. French planters believed the warm, humid climate of Vietnam would suit it well. Music. They were wrong. Arabica struggled here. The plants were vulnerable to disease. The yields were disappointing. Season after season, the crop that was supposed to make colonial plantations rich instead left them frustrated. But there was one region that would change everything. Deep in the south-central part of the country lies a highland plateau called the Central Highlands, home to a town called Buon Ma Thuột. The soil there is a deep, reddish basalt formed by ancient volcanic activity. Music. It looked, to the right eyes, almost perfect for coffee. Nobody knew it yet, but this small plateau would one day become the coffee capital of an entire nation. By the early 20th century, French planters were running out of patience. Arabica kept failing. Disease kept spreading through the plantations. Something had to change. Music. Around this time, planters began introducing a different variety, Robusta. And the name alone tells you what people thought of it. In the world of coffee, Robusta was, and often still is seen as the lesser bean. It is more bitter. It has less of the delicate, complex flavor that coffee experts prize in Arabica. What it lacks in refinement, however, it makes up for in something far more valuable to a struggling farmer: toughness. Robusta plants resist disease far better than Arabica. They tolerate heat, humidity, and the harsh, unpredictable conditions of Vietnam's climate. They produce more cherries per plant, more reliably, season after season. It was not the bean anyone had dreamed of growing. It was simply the bean that survived. And here is the twist nobody could have predicted. While coffee growers around the world spent the 20th century chasing the reputation of Arabica, competing for prestige, for delicate flavor notes, for premium prices, Vietnam quietly built its entire coffee industry on the bean everyone else looked down on. It turns out that being underestimated can be a strange kind of advantage. Nobody was competing for the bean nobody wanted. That left the door wide open. And perhaps your journey with English is not so different. You may feel that you learn too slowly. Other people may not notice your progress, and sometimes you may even underestimate yourself. But there is freedom in growing quietly. You can make mistakes, repeat the same sentence, and improve without needing to compete with anyone. Like the coffee bean that others once ignored, your small daily efforts may not seem important today, but with enough patience, they may open doors you cannot yet see. But before Vietnam could walk through that door, it would have to survive decades of devastation. From the 1940s through the 1970s, Vietnam endured almost continuous conflict, first in its resistance against French colonial rule, and later in its resistance against American military intervention. Farmland became battlefields. Roads and bridges were destroyed. Millions of people were displaced. Plantations that had taken decades to establish were abandoned, damaged, or simply left to grow wild, unattended, and unharvested. By 1975, when the war finally ended and the country was reunified, Vietnam faced an entirely new set of crises. The economy was in ruins. International trade was cut off through years of embargo and isolation. Food shortages were common. Basic goods were scarce. In this environment, coffee was barely an afterthought. By the early 1980s, Vietnam's coffee production was tiny, almost irrelevant on the world stage. The plateau in the Central Highlands, once seen as promising, sat mostly quiet. If you had told anyone at that moment that this country would soon become one of the largest coffee producers on the planet, they would not have believed you. This was rock bottom. And it is often at rock bottom that the biggest transformations begin. In 1986, the Vietnamese government opened the door to private enterprise, and coffee became a powerful symbol of this new beginning. Across the fertile red soil of the Central Highlands, families planted endless rows of Robusta, dark, earthy, intensely bitter, and full of character. Production soared from only about 6,000 tons a year to more than 1.6 million tons, making Vietnam the world's largest Robusta producer. Behind this remarkable rise were generations of farmers whose patient hands turned a once unwanted bean into the bold, aromatic taste of a nation. Like coffee dripping slowly through a phin, Vietnam's success did not come overnight. It grew one tree, one harvest, and one determined family at a time. Growing the beans was only half the story. Vietnam did something else, something rarer. It invented an entirely new way to drink coffee. Take café sura, iced milk coffee, arguably Vietnam's most famous creation. In the early 20th century, fresh dairy milk was scarce in Vietnam and difficult to preserve in the tropical heat, since refrigeration was far from common. French condensed milk, sweet and shelf-stable, became the practical substitute. What started as a workaround for a supply problem became something else entirely. A rich, sweet, intensely flavorful drink, completely unlike coffee anywhere else in the world. Then there is the phin, the small metal filter that sits directly on top of the cup, letting coffee drip through slowly, drop by drop, sometimes taking several minutes to finish. In a world that increasingly prized speed, Vietnam built a coffee ritual around patience. You do not rush a phin, you wait for it. In Hanoi, in the 1940s, another shortage sparked another invention. Milk was scarce, but eggs were not. Someone history remembers, no single inventor with certainty began whipping egg yolks with sugar into a thick custard-like foam and pouring it over strong black coffee. The result was café trung, egg coffee, rich, slightly sweet, almost like drinking a dessert. What began as an ingenious substitute became, decades later, one of Hanoi's most iconic exports of flavor. And more recently, in the central city of Hue, another twist emerged. Café Mui, salt coffee. A small amount of salted cream drizzled over black coffee, creating a striking contrast between sweet, salty, and bitter in a single sip. Notice the pattern running through every single one of these drinks. Not one of them was created out of abundance. Every single one was invented as a response to scarcity. No fresh milk, no shortcuts, no easy answers. And every single time, that limitation became the seed of something genuinely original. Today, Vietnam's bold, dark Robusta wakes millions of people around the world, but its true soul is best tasted at home. From creamy egg coffee to sweet iced coffee, and the surprising touch of salted cream, every cup carries a flavor you will remember long after the final sip. Vietnam's coffee story still faces an uncertain future, but its farmers and baristas continue to protect, improve, and reinvent that tradition. So if you ever travel to Vietnam, do not simply visit the famous places. Sit beside a busy street, order a coffee, and wait as it drips slowly through a phin. Because sometimes, the deepest memory of a country is not something you see, it is something you taste. Vietnamese coffee was never supposed to be great. It was planted by outsiders for someone else's profit. It was grown from a bean the rest of the world considered second best. It survived decades of war, only to be rebuilt from almost nothing. And its most famous drinks were not born from luxury, but from scarcity. Condensed milk in place of fresh, whipped egg yolk in place of milk at all. Vietnamese coffee was never created under perfect conditions. The first plants came from another country. The local climate rejected the delicate beans that French growers originally wanted. War destroyed farms, separated families, and left the nation struggling to rebuild itself. Even Vietnam's most famous coffee drinks were born from what people did not have. When fresh milk was difficult to find, they used condensed milk. When milk became scarce, they whipped egg yolks with sugar. When bitterness needed balance, they added cream, sweetness, and even a little salt. The Vietnamese people did not wait for perfect ingredients. They worked with what was available and created something the world would remember. Perhaps learning English feels similar. You may not have many hours to study. You may forget new words. You may listen to a sentence several times and still understand only part of it. Sometimes, you may look at fluent speakers and feel that your own progress is too slow. But remember the Vietnamese phin. It never fills the cup all at once. It works one drop at a time. Your English grows in the same way. One word remembered, one sentence understood, one story completed. A single drop may seem insignificant, but thousands of drops can eventually fill an entire cup. And just as Vietnamese coffee became stronger through hardship, your difficulties can become part of your learning. Every mistake teaches you something. Every moment of confusion prepares your mind to understand more the next time. So be patient with yourself. You do not need to learn everything today. You only need to keep listening, keep practicing, and allow each small lesson to become part of you. Perhaps tomorrow morning, when you hold a cup of coffee, you will remember that its journey took more than a century. It survived failure, war, scarcity, and change before becoming something loved around the world. Your journey may also take time, but word by word, story by story, and cup by cup, you are getting closer. Thank you for learning with Story English Zone. If this story helped you practice your English, subscribe and join us for the next journey. Until then, enjoy your coffee and keep going, one slow drop at a time.